And also, I quite like the fact that Stoicism gives me permission to not worry about like what other people are doing. I don't have to try and change people. Like that's a relief. Um, that's a big burden to carry when you're trying to change everyone around you. When you're trying to change governments, when you're trying to change your friends, when you're trying to change your family. Like Stoicism says, put that down.
Welcome to Stoic Conversations. In this conversation, I talk with Brigid Delaney. Brigid is a speechwriter, columnist for The Guardian, and author of the book Reasons Not to Worry: How to Be Stoic in Chaotic Times, which covers her journey from Stoic skeptic to practicing Stoic. In this conversation, we cover Brigid's recent journey into Stoicism and why she thinks Stoicism has more to offer than other forms of self-help or development she has tried in the past. We also cover some disagreements or challenges she has with Stoicism. This episode is really about the journey of putting Stoicism into practice and the ups and downs that come with that. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Brigid. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for
Yeah.
coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, I really wanted to talk to you about your book, Reasons Not to Worry. I
Hmm.
really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was a lovely, I mean, we'll get into it as we talk, but I thought it was a lovely introduction to somebody, yourself experiencing Stoicism for the first time, incorporating it into your life. But before I skip that part, I guess, could you say how you discovered Stoicism, a bit about your journey into Stoic philosophy?
Yeah, sure. I did 1 year of philosophy at university, and it was a lot of almost mathematics, logical positivism, and that turned me right off. So I dropped out, and then didn't think about philosophy much for many years. And then I had a column at the Guardian newspaper, and each week I would write about something that had been happening in my life. And one week, an editor sent me a press release saying, "There's a week coming up called Stoic Week. Would I try and live like a Stoic for a week?" And I joined that group, and I just didn't take it very seriously. I wrote a humorous column, kind of taking the mickey out of it a bit, and then I got some blowback from Stoics saying, "You've completely missed the point of what Stoicism is. It's a fantastic, very helpful tool for a lot of people, and it's a real shame that the Guardian didn't take it more seriously." So I took that feedback on board, and the following year I went back and did Stoic Week just independently, um, and got a lot out of it, and I did it with a group of friends. So we had our own discussion group at night after we'd done the readings, and I mentioned to a friend at the end of Stoic Week that I was interested in taking it further, and so was he. So we ended up having a kind of almost like mimicking, I guess, a way a lot of the old philosophers taught philosophy, which is through friendship, dialogue, applying what was going on in our lives to the teachings, walking and talking about these things. And that's how my interest kind of developed.
Yeah, well, that's something you talk about in the book. I believe it's Andrew. Andrew is your friend who you were discussed Stoicism with.
Yeah, yeah.
It almost reminded me of this, like Seneca and Lucilius, like back and forth correspondence. You'd come up with a new topic and you debate it, and you'd throw it back and forth. I think that's a really fun structure to it. Um, in terms of your background, I I know you've had a lot of involvement in the contemporary wellness or self help communities. How do you think your experience with Stoicism has differed from that? What has been, I guess, the main differences between ancient Greek philosophy and then other kind of wellness movements that you've written about or participated in?
Sure thing. So, for background for your listeners, I wrote a book called Wellmania, which became a Netflix show that was released last year. And that whole journey of Wellmania was trying different types of wellness treatments, getting involved in different subcultures, the yoga community, various other communities. Um, and I found there was a lot of crossover with Stoicism and some of the more spiritual elements of wellness, like, for example, Vedic meditation. So, what is in the Vedas, and also some of Buddhism. You're coming across a lot of Stoic teachings. So I was fascinated about, like, where did they intersect historically? Like, was there, you know people trading between, say, India or China and Greece, and there were discussions and cross pollinations of ideas. So that aspect of, I guess you'd call it wellness, but it's actually more spirituality, connected with Stoicism a lot. The more modern day wellness stuff, I I say this in Wellmania, it makes you feel good short term. You feel great. You go to a retreat, you pay thousands of dollars, you connect with people, you feel like you can cope with your problems back at home because you're all relaxed. But then you go back into your normal life, and that retreat and that money, it's just the effects wear off very quickly. Um, Whereas Stoicism is about, well, look, every single day, what can you do, no matter where you are, to give yourself equilibrium, like the Ataraxia, that's so important, the virtues. So, yeah, it's not contingent on spending a sum of money. It's not contingent on flying to Southeast Asia and going to a retreat. It is something that you carry around with you. I mean, would you
Yeah,
say that's your experience of Stoicism? It's very portable.
I think it's very portable. I mean, to follow up on what you were saying, I think there's this. Um, well, I guess there's the two ideas there. One is you said something that I think Stoicism is almost this inversion of, where you're like, wellness is like you feel good in the moment and then it doesn't stay with you. And I think
Mm,
Stoicism, there's this idea of like it feels bad in the moment. You're like, oh, it's kind of your fault if you're getting angry, or maybe you have some work to do, and it's not this.
mm,
It's, you can't point the fingers at other people. So it's kind of difficult in the moment, but helps you later on. So it's almost this inversion of that. I also think I agree with the idea that it's not it's not circumstantial, I guess. So it's portable in the sense that you can do it wherever you are, right? You don't need to be in the perfect environment to be like, well, my relaxation depends, as you said, on the right room or the right people or the right being on vacation. It's this idea of I'm going to be relaxed, I'm going to be well, and because I'm generating it, I'm going to bring it around wherever I go.
mm.
Um, yeah, do you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. And it's, there's a whole interesting argument about capitalism and Stoicism. So some
Yeah.
of the kind of pushback I've had is, um, there's a new movement of Stoics, and they're all about the money. They're all about incorporating this philosophy into a capitalist model, making money, etc. Now, some people might do that, but I don't think people use Stoicism in a capitalist way. I think people use Stoicism almost in a way that's anti-wellness industry, which is you train yourself to resist the easy options, the easy way out. It's it's not monetizable. A lot of this journaling.
Hmm.
Checking in on how your reactions are. They're all stuff that is very within you, and that's why it's appealing. You don't have to go and, like, I'm self-taught. I didn't have to go and spend thousands of dollars to do a course, and that's what I'm kind of interested in with the Stoic sort of journey. Like, my next steps is thinking about community. So how can you take
Hmm.
it, similar to what you're doing with the podcast? How can you take these teachings, give it more of a community feel, but don't have a big barrier to entry. Like, don't sort of charge people stuff. And I think that's a really exciting thing about Stoicism.
Yeah, well, your example of talking with Andrew, right? It's this philosophical education, and all you need is a friendship, basically friendship and a willingness to engage.
Mm,
Um, or I think of Socrates walking around the agora. He's not he's not handing out cards for his courses, right? He's like, let's talk about
yeah,
philosophy right now. Let's do it.
yeah.
Um,
And I think
I
there's a
think
hunger for that. Like, I think I went to a friend's birthday party recently, and it was 4 days on this island. And it was people that didn't know each other, and each of us had to bring something to the party, so to speak. And I ran a Stoic workshop, and I've split everyone into groups. after I taught the basics of Stoicism. And I said, okay, you guys talk about a problem you've had this week and apply Stoicism and see how that works. And it was mostly men in these groups. They loved sharing, but also using a philosophy to help each other. There's this sense of if you have a problem, you have to engage with a therapist or you have to kind of like go outside to some trained professional. But we actually have the ability in low level problems, I'm not talking big mental health issues, but we have the capacity to support each other. And I think Stoicism is a great framework to give other people support. Support yourself, but also teach other people the basics of Stoicism and share, each week say, check in with your friends, how you going? And they're like, had a bad day with my boss. It's like, okay, well, let's see what the philosophy says about that. So I think it's got real potential that just needs to be unlocked.
Yeah, this is not something, I mean, I love this, and it's not something I've really thought about before is the barrier. It really seems to me it's about getting people engaged in it and interested in it. But if that interest is there, then as you said, there's not really a barrier to entry. It strikes me also as there's this idea in Stoicism of cosmopolitanism, this is real kind of egalitarian underpinning of that, we're all rational creatures. We all have access to our minds. And so we can all be great philosophers. And
Mm,
back in the day, they extended that to women. And, that's more obvious now, but was really progressive back then. And I feel there's maybe what you're saying is a similar thing about, this is not something that's restricted to the academy. It's not something that's restricted just to the experts. We can always rely on people and their expertise, but there is something to be gained from just having good, engaged conversations with friends and relying on the wisdom of some smart people whose ideas are free now.
yeah,
Um, is that right?
absolutely. And I write about this in the book, which is all the things we're going through. We think we're so modern. They've gone through, like, they are actually, in many ways, very similar to our society. Like, it's like they existed 10 years ago. Um, they're extraordinary. But they've thought it all through. They've thought about, well, how do we deal with disappointment? How do we deal with death? How do we deal with being defamed? How do we deal with a pylon or a mob, which is like very much what happens on X.com, or social media? How do we deal with disappointment in love? How do we deal with getting a diagnosis, a terminal diagnosis? So they've done all this thinking and their wisdom is there. We just have to kind of take it off the shelf and
Hmm.
apply it. So that's the wild thing for me. Is like it's already the answers we seek are already there, and I never get let down. I don't agree with everything the Stoics say, but I'm never let down by their advice. They always give me something to think about, and it just always seems like incredibly relevant to modern life.
Well, going back to that, the point you made earlier, we were talking about there are some things that are difficult, but maybe good for you. What's something in discovering Stoicism that maybe was not intuitive or you disagreed with, but has now proven helpful in your own life?
I mean, sadly, this is a sadness for me about Stoicism. I mean, I love Ataraxia. I love that baseline state that we should try and reach, which is equilibrium, being chilled out. But you have to forego a bit of excitement. So in order not to go down, you can't go too far up. And um, when I was mentioning before about this Netflix series, when I got the news about the Netflix show, I was so excited. But I was also studying Stoicism, and the Stoics are saying, hang on, don't get carried away with something because there will be a corresponding emotion. And there was with that whole project, there was massive highs and massive lows. Had I approached it more stoically, I'd be less high and I probably would have gone less low. And so now when I get good news, I like receiving good news, but I am aware that it evens out.
Hmm.
Nothing's 100% great. There'll always be a flip side. And so it's better to have an even temperament with whatever comes along. So good news, bad news, just treat it all fairly evenly. But it does mean, you miss out on that dopamine high when you do get good news. So I've trained myself out of the highs, but I miss them. But the Stoics were right. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, that makes me think of. I did this. I don't think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I did this basically this YouTube video with a famous person in the martial arts scene, and I interviewed them, and I was like really excited to look at the YouTube comments, could be like, what are people saying? Because I wanted that high of like the compliments and the good comments, and then there's also the negative comments, and it was like, oh, I can't. It's like if I play the game of like feeling the highs, if I like basically if I open myself up emotionally to the randomness of the internet and the flow of internet strangers, if you try to get the high of those random compliments, you'll get the low of the random really mean things people say. And I think I arrived at almost the same conclusion of like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't really expose yourself to the high and protect yourself to the low. It's better to just be like, I'm proud of what I did. It doesn't matter what other people think. That matters. That applies when they say mean things, but unfortunately, it also applies when they say nice things. I need to just kind of focus on the craft. That was a lesson for me. I really resonate with that one.
It's a
Um,
total lesson. Like, so a colleague yesterday who didn't know I'd written this book looked it up on Goodreads, and she's like, "Oh, you're on Goodreads," and I'm like, "Oh, don't open it." And she said, "Oh, this is 5-star review," and she started reading it, and I shut it down because it's like I don't engage with the good, and I don't engage with the bad. I don't engage with any of it, so I don't want to hear about the great review because for every great review, there's someone that was like thought it was a horrible book. So,
mhm,
um, and I think that's good. I think that serves you because you then write the book that you think, like the next book you go to write, you don't have the voices in your ear of the 1-star review because you always remember the 1-star review. You never remember the 5-star. And so you're much more guided by your own inner instincts, principles, creativity. And look, it's interesting. The Stoics didn't have, I mean, they got so much right, but they weren't existing in this insane world that we're in now where everyone's opinion all of the time is available to you at the click of a button. So it's
mhm,
an extraordinary like moment in history we're living in. And I think Stoicism is really suited for it because it does say, don't be swayed by the opinions of others because you'll go mad. You won't be
mhm.
able to focus on the actual craft. So yeah, I just have these thought experiments of like, if Seneca was around now, what would he say about the U.S. election, or what would he say? Like I just love thinking about what they would think of things right now.
Well, they become like friends in a way. They become friends.
Mm.
You talk about this example of going around talking about the friends, and Seneca becomes a friend. Epictetus becomes a friend. It's a person who you rely on and go back to and get their opinion on something. So I think it's very natural to be like, yeah, like I want to talk to my friend about this. I want to know what they have
Yeah,
to think about this topic. And it's kind of it's disappointing. But as you said before, there's often such a breadth. Maybe it's not the U.S. election, but there's some comment about Roman politics that will apply, right? There's some
yeah.
similarity somewhere.
There always is, and it's interesting what you were saying before about they become friends. Like I, I mean, I really mourn the loss of literature from the Greek Stoic period. Like I just think what a tragedy that we don't have the full sort of suite of work, but we do have obviously the Romans. So I rely on, as do many, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. But I use them at different points. Like meditations
Mm.
is when I'm feeling like introspective and kind of there's a romanticism in meditations. The language is so beautiful, and I read that to kind of get in a mood. And Epictetus is like if I want to be fired up, like he's got these short, sharp sentences. Some of the translations I read, he says, "Man," like, "Hey, man, stop being lazy," and it's like having a hardcore dad. And Seneca's the most complex one, I reckon. Like he's a beautiful writer, but then you start reading the biographies and you're like, wow, what a life that guy had. Like that was insane. But also he wrote so much. And before I discovered his philosophies, I really liked his plays. So in Sydney, Thyestes was put on a few years ago, and it was just extraordinary. Like just the most amazing play. And then you discover all these moral letters and all this other work. And he was in politics, so it was extraordinary.
Yeah, he wasn't sitting around writing all day. He was busy too. It's very very impressive. If you had to pick a favorite, I feel like this is a good litmus test for the Stoics. Be like, who's your favorite of those three?
Oh, it changes all the time. Look, Marcus at the moment, just because of his voice, I think his voice it's so beautiful. He's such a beautiful writer. I'm doing another book. It's due next week. Another Stoicism book, and I'm using Seneca the most. Like Seneca is the most useful, I think, because the letters to Lucilius, on the shortness of life, all the consolations, like that is where there's a lot of useful material. But Marcus Aurelius's kind of cadence, I think his way of writing is great to kind of steep yourself in. So yeah, I'm back in them in a big way right now, which is great. I say this in the book as well, like, and this is something for your listeners, which I found really important. You can't just read them once and then think you get Stoicism. Like it is. So I was brought up Catholic, and I'm like, oh, I now understand why we went to mass every week. We had religious education classes every day, and the church had a structure where it was drummed into you every day. This is what the Bible says, and Stoicism doesn't have that structure, but you need to create a structure around it because you forget, like you forget how to control anger, you forget ataraxia, you forget about the virtues. So you almost have to have like a religious practice with it. I mean, what's your kind of view on that?
I mean, I totally agree. I think there's the three practices. Seneca is a friend, and he's writing to Lucilius. Marcus Aurelius is that deep introspection. He's journaling, and Epictetus is a teacher. He's a pedagogue. He's writing to his students. So there's these you can engage meaningful with other people. You can have your own personal practice of reflection, or you can seek out a coach. And it's really just serendipitous that we have these three paradigms or these three examples. I think repetition
And
is
they
really
also
important.
have different backgrounds. Like they are
Mhm.
an emperor, a self-made guy, and a slave.
Yeah, it's we're really lucky. That's the thing that I take. I mean, you talked about grieving. We're both sad to have lost what we lost and have so little remaining because that's such a small subsection, but what a beautiful subsection it is. We're really lucky to have that. I think a practice, I'm a pretty introspective guy. So I often read Stoicism. When I'm doing conversations like this is the kind of friend example, right? Like we're just engaging in it, debating it. But really it's become my Epictetus talks about having a scale to measure things by, right? Like a way to test, is that a real coin or a fake coin when you receive an impression? And Stoicism has just become my scale. It's just a part of me. So in terms of my practice, it's just always something I'm bringing up, always something I'm calling to mind because I've been studying it for a long time. I think before it was reading until it became ingrained. I don't know if I have a formal practice now so much that it's just become a part of me, so it's repetitive. But I totally
Mhm.
agree with you that it's not a thing you read once, and I think there's a not dangerous, but you're not getting the full value if you read the quote. Quotes are great, but you're not getting the full value if you read the quote once. There's just a depth to it that might not be immediately obvious.
Yeah, and I think I mean, a lot of people who are struggling with something and they're like, I'm going to go, so I bought meditations, and they read meditations and they don't understand it. They're like, it doesn't make any sense to them. And I think Meditations is an amazing book, but it's not a good in without knowing what the philosophy is. So I say to people, get a basic guide, like written by someone who is decoding it, and then you go into the primary sources, and the primary sources will be your friends. And then if you're further interested, you go into the academic work. So I had a kind of unpleasant interview recently. I didn't know I would be debating some like incredibly brilliant academic who really was very angry at kind of modern Stoicism and took aim at me and said that we were um, a group of people that were shallow thinkers. We'd commodified it. Um, and she'd written about Stoicism and no one had bought her book. And um, so I kind of my message for that is like, it's not the same thing. Like the people who are doing the basic stuff like me, it's a way in. So people come in through that. But then it opens up the academic work of people who have spent their lives kind of going, you know, into one Seneca, work. So I think there's like levels, and you start with a simple book. You go into the primary sources, then you go into the academic work, and then you have your own practice, and you're good to go.
I think that sounds really reasonable to me. Not to like, I think you're right. And I think to your credit, it's a lot of it is about the way you frame it, right? So you
Mm,
frame it in your book, which is to say, I'm paraphrasing, but like I'm a person who engaged in this journey, and I'm going to write about this journey, and hopefully that journey is helpful to you. And that's the way I feel that your book is framed, and in that context, that's incredibly helpful. And one of the things that I've found also is that I don't want to get too abstract here, but I find that once you've studied Stoicism for too long, you almost forget how the world looks to non-Stoics. So
mm,
there's a real beauty in actually capturing that transition point. There's a
yeah,
real beauty in writing a book that is to say, look, I have one foot in before I studied Stoicism. I've got one foot in Stoicism, and now I'm going to kind of explain how I started to understand these things and put them into my life, and
mm,
that's what I see your book doing. That provides it carries someone else along that similar journey in a way that they wouldn't get just jumping into Epictetus, for example.
yeah. It's you need a guide, really.
Hmm.
And I look back to the original Stoics. It was a marketplace. The Stoa, the painted porch. It was of the street, and that's kind of my interest at the moment is bringing philosophy that is helpful and useful to people who need it. So, how do you get it out of the academy into like where, I mean, you would have listeners from all over the world, but definitely in Australia, where I'm speaking to you from, we're in the middle of a major mental health crisis. Like, there's not enough.
Hmm.
Um, there's a lot of 1 in 4 people get depression. There's not enough psychologists. It's really hard. And so, how can we make things better for people? Well, we can give people a framework, or Stoicism can give people a framework to better like cope with the difficulties that they have in their life. And I think that's a great thing. And so I want everyone to know about Stoicism. Like I'm a real evangelicist, like because it's not promising something in the afterlife. It's not. It's also not anesthetizing you. Like there's so much of what our society offers people who are stressed or worried or unhappy is it anesthetizes them. It's like Netflix, streaming, alcohol, drugs, pornography. It's all about dulling your experience in the world so you don't feel the pain. Whereas Stoicism is about clarity. It's about saying you're going to feel the pain, but the pain's not going to be as bad as you think it's going to be. And that I think is, a revelation.
Yeah, Bridget, you're pumping me up. This is getting me really excited. I
Yeah.
really agree with this mission statement. That's part of the reason why I left academia as well. Was I was just not that there's anything wrong with being an academic, but I was really, it's like you gain all this knowledge. And I had this real interest in saying, well, there's people who could benefit from this that didn't have either the opportunity, the luck, or the timing to kind of get a background in this or an education in this. So I'm really pro this popularization, or basically just like sharing it and communicating it. If you had to if you had to persuade somebody towards Stoicism, or somebody who's like, maybe thinks that, it's not for them, or philosophy is not for them, well, how would you persuade them? What's kind of this, I guess, the elevator pitch of Stoicism in your view?
Well, firstly, I'd find out if they need it. So they might not be interested because they've got a religious belief, or they've got something that is their kind of North Star. If they didn't have a North Star, I would persuade them by saying, you're going to go through some stuff in life, as is everyone, that is going to be really challenging. And this is something that can take you from cradle to grave and give you guidance on how to cope with not only the good stuff, but also the bad stuff that will inevitably happen to you. And wouldn't you rather have that? Wouldn't you rather have something in your toolkit than be left alone to fend for yourself when you lose all your money, you've been slandered, you, as I said, get a diagnosis of something, when your loved ones die, when you die. Stoicism kind of it shepherds you through all those things, and yeah, it's extraordinary. Someone I know recently told me that they've been diagnosed with a terminal illness, which was, it's terrible news. But my stoic brain was saying, this is terrible what's happened to you. Also, it's going to happen to everyone. You're not alone in facing death. Like, all of us in this room at some point will be there, but we're not taught how to deal with that. So people
Mm-hmm.
are given terrible news in a doctor's room or whatever, and they're sent home with a pamphlet. And if they're not religious, or they don't have a philosophy like Stoicism, they are alone with this terrible kind of news, and there's no way of framing it. Whereas the Stoics
And
say, "Oh, we're all going to die, so let's talk about how we can make sense of it."
for me, that comes back to your metaphor of being anesthetized, or having clarity, right? And somebody's going through this illness, and there can be this view, I think at least, where people give this impression of Stoicism as being maybe non-empathetic, but I think often people are, I don't want to say cynical, but like they almost don't want to engage with the inevitability of something like death, for example. So they're not
Mm,
empathetic or present because it's scary, and they'd rather still like not engage with it. And I
mm,
think that if you can have that clarity with so many things, this clarity of like what you're going through is terrible, but but in other ways it's not unique. It's a very human thing. It's a thing that we will all experience. We all need to understand how to navigate as well as possible. Um, it's almost like ripping a band-aid in a sense of like, again, it's harder in the moment. It's not the 4-day retreat or vacation, but it's a much more clear way to live, as you were saying. It's an honest and truthful way, I think. um
yeah, and there's this. I mean, a lot of Stoicism is it's rooted in reality, and
mhm.
I think that's the kind of that's the shocking thing about it, which is we often don't realize we're very unconscious about what reality really means. We kind of see the world as we want to see it. So um, if we're in a job that we don't like and we think our boss is um, terrible, we'll see him as a terrible person. We will see that side of him, and he'll become an ogre, and our experience will kind of be shaded by that viewpoint. But Stoicism kind of challenges us to say, is he really an ogre, or sort of did you bring your feelings onto him and interpret him just in a very one-sided way? So it says, don't, be in reality. Look at what the world really is, and be in that reality. If you think I'm really great at my job, I'm going to definitely get a promotion, and that is your thinking, I'm so good, I'm going to get a promotion. It doesn't happen, someone else gets the promotion ahead of you, you're devastated, and then that then makes you unhappy, because you weren't really in reality, which might be like, I'm good at my job, but also so are 5 other people. So I could get a promotion, but so could they. So that's the kind of daily challenge of Stoicism, which is recognize your reality and live in it, as unpleasant as that may be sometimes. Strip away the illusions.
And how do you? I mean, how do you do that? How do you put that into practice? What are your techniques that you employ?
Well, I have to just keep reminding myself. I don't have any tattoos, but if I was to have one, it would say reality. And I'd have to be in reality. Like don't be in a dream world. And there's this great book by a Jesuit priest, a theologian called Anthony de Mello, called I think it's called Awareness, and it is all about that. It's and the Veda, like a lot of Vedic meditation and Vedic philosophy is about that as well, which is if you see the world for what it really is, and it's also if you look at nature and take cues from nature. So you'll see animals kill each other. The natural world is violent. Things die. There's seasons. That is, we are part of that. So being in reality is also about, looking around. What does reality look like for a bird? What does it look like for, you know, a tree? And we are part of that system. So, which is also like a very Stoic thing with Gaia. And Marcus talks a lot about that in meditations. So, yeah, I'd look at my wrist if I had a tattoo. Reality, reality, reality. Every day, every interaction. I mean, do you find that how's your grip on reality?
Yeah, I think it's all right. I mean, you'd have to ask some. Could ask the people close to me, and they could see if they disagree. It's something I definitely work on, and it really resonates what you're saying. It's just that idea of living in accordance with the truth, right? The way things
Mm,
are. You quote this passage from Marcus in your book, but this idea of the passage he has. Again, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's like you look at the purple robe. It's just a piece of cloth stained with the dye of a
mm,
shellfish, or your big feast is just a corpse of a pig or something.
mm,
And there's this idea of when we receive these impressions, we always code them, or everything we encounter in the world, we're always kind of running through this filter of our own biases and our own perspective. And I see it as you're saying of reality as cutting through that to the things uncolored by those judgments, which just comes back to this Stoic idea of living in accordance with nature, right? Like
mm,
that's sounds it always sounds like such an abstract thing, live in accordance with nature, but it is that thing of you said of just reality. And I
mm.
always think of live in accordance with the way, the facts of the world, the way things really are, and always try to embrace that and accept that as soon as possible. Um, I think your example is great of like, there's some sort of injustice has happened to me because I didn't get this job. And that ability to actually step back and see the world as it really is and say, well, there was other people that were qualified. And even if there weren't other people that were qualified, people are going to have problems and biases. And my boss is a person, and they then acted out their problems like people with problems do.
Mm.
Um, Marcus Aurelius has this another line about, don't expect a fig tree not to produce figs. And so,
Yeah,
even if an injustice is encountered to you, there's another disconnect with, even if you've encountered a real injustice, there's another disconnect from reality to expect not to encounter injustices, to
yeah.
be surprised that something bad has happened. So there's almost those two layers.
I think where the tension for me lay in Stoicism, and this is right through the book, is idealism. I'm an idealistic person. I want the world to be a certain way. I want it to be a more just world. And the tension of Stoicism is between accepting reality and fighting injustice. So, how do you, and that's what Andrew and I talked a lot about in our Stoic conversations, which was okay, you want to fight against climate change or whatever your issue is, problems in the Middle East, whatever it is. How do you reconcile that with Stoicism? Like it was a very hard kind of thing to debate, and we ended up kind of settling on the fact that justice is a virtue. So the Stoics didn't completely kind of chuck it out. They saw justice as a virtue, but it didn't sit that well with Epictetus's dichotomy of control. So I mean, I'm wondering what your views are on the social justice issue.
Oh, well, I can always, I, I'm curious about first how how did you resolve that tension, or what did you, and then I'll jump in because I'm worried I'll go down a rabbit hole. How did you? I totally agree with that problem, but how did you, I guess, resolve it, or where did you land on it?
Well, landed with the justice principle, the justice virtue. My interpretation of the Stoics was that um, you should definitely fight for justice, and they did. Like they were powerful people who were very active in public life. Um, so you should definitely fight, but you shouldn't be necessarily so connected to the outcomes that you're devastated if you don't get what you want. So an
Mhm.
example of that was a few years ago. Me and a friend called Matt. I used to be a lawyer, and we were very interested in the death penalty and did a lot of work around the death penalty, particularly sending students over to the US to work on death row cases. And then we became interested in death row issues in Southeast Asia, and we formed a group called the Mercy Campaign that ended up advocating for two Australians on death row. And we put everything into it. We were visited them. We had this website. We were agitating petitions, and in 2015, the people we were agitating for were executed. So the campaign didn't work, and it was
Uh,
utterly devastating. Um, it was, I still can't really talk about it without getting upset today. Um, and I thought about that a lot when I was writing the book. I was like, well, what would have, had I been a Stoic then, what would have changed? Would I have been less upset when they were executed? Like, I don't know. I don't know if I
mhm.
would want to be less upset. But I would have probably been a lot more detached, I think. But I still would have fought. So, it's this thing of you fight, but you fight with detachment, and you fight knowing that you mightn't win. And if you don't win, you go, okay, well, we didn't win. But when people are killed because you didn't win, it's very hard to be detached.
Yeah, I think it's a resonant story. It's a sad story, but I think it's a really good example. Um, my general thought on this is in Stoicism says that, we feel emotions when we care about things, right?
Mm,
And the goal of Stoicism is to care about the right things. And so there's kind of two answers here. One is that, um, Stoicism has gotten some things wrong and we should care about
mm,
people dying. That's just a bad thing. Dying
mm,
unjustly is just a bad thing. And Stoicism has, they're right that we shouldn't care about social media, but they're wrong about that. That's
mm,
one answer to it. It's just to kind of change the Stoic position, which is a legitimate thing to do. Another thing to do is to say, look, there's kind of a spectrum of advanced, like you, you have a beginning practitioner and you have an advanced practitioner, and like just because the sage can advocate for people on death row and can not be upset or perturbed, or disturbed when they fail, that doesn't mean I am a sage yet. That doesn't mean that has to be my response. And also, I shouldn't pretend like it's my response. I think that's something I wrestle with in Stoicism a lot. Is
mm,
I think like if I'm upset about something and one answer is Stoicism is wrong and I should be upset about it, but another answer is I'm just not advanced enough yet. But I
mm,
shouldn't pretend like I'm advanced. I shouldn't try to jump to this step. I should feel that. And if you're going to have an incorrect value judgment, much better your incorrect value judgment and your detachment from reality be about, oh, I valued people's lives a little bit too much, or
mm,
in a kind of way where I assumed they were going to live longer than they would. That's a very good vice compared to
mm,
being over attached to other kinds of things. So I think
mm,
it's like in the spectrum of problems, it's a relatively small problem. And maybe it's a large problem in terms of the subjective experience of like going through grief or dealing with those kinds of issues. But I think it's in terms of progressing, it's like better to make mistakes in that area than be I don't know, be totally detached in that area and then overly attached to, money or pleasure or something like this, right?
Yeah,
Those are my
absolutely.
initial thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and there's that's where the justice thing intersects, because if
Mm-hmm.
you so this was the state murdering people. I think that's unjust. I think if I touch wood, that if I had a heart attack like tonight, it's not unjust. It's
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate, but it's also nature. It's the body which is subject to the forces of nature. So there's not. It's when they talk about death and suffering. Is it an unjust death, or is it a death that's part of nature? And that's kind of part of my thinking now on how I deal with other forms of grief or other forms of disappointment.
This is something that I've thought about. I mean, just to build on that, this is something that I'm not sure I have a good answer to, but about, if virtue and vice are good and bad,
Mm,
isn't the vice of other people bad? Like, shouldn't we be upset when the state unjustly murders somebody? Because that is not, as you said, it's not a hurricane, or it's not, it is injustice being enacted. And there's something wrong about that. That's something about Stoicism that I wrestle too, is about how to feel about the vice of other people, or
yeah.
like human caused vice, basically.
Well, I think where I'm at the moment is that it's outside our field of control. So you can
Hmm.
what other people do and their vices. You can't change that. You can be a counterpoint, and I think that's why activism is a good thing. Like you you may not you may not get your result as an activist, but you're showing a counterpoint to something that you think is unjust. So people in a democracy or whatever can see the counterpoint, and it gives them something to think about. So if something's not counted, um, then it's very hard for people to see the alternative or see how a resistance might happen. But it's that detach. It's kind of like, yeah, it's the detachment from the outcome, which is, I think, the main sort of Stoic thing. And also, I quite like the fact that Stoicism gives me permission to not worry about like what other people are doing. I don't have to try and change people. Like that's a relief. Um, that's a big burden to carry when you're trying to change everyone around you. When you're trying to change governments, when you're trying to change your friends, when you're trying to change your family, like Stoicism says, put that down. You just have to focus on yourself. And then you become a living kind of active counterpoint to vice if you embrace the virtues.
Yeah, there's this. I think there's this idea in this utilitarian way of thinking, which is to say, how upset you get about something corresponds to how much you care about it, right?
Mm,
And the Stoicism agrees with that to an extent. So there's an argument there, but it kind of gives you permission to say, well, what you care about, as you said, is how well you're being a counterpoint to that thing. What
mm,
you care about is how well you're kind of working on yourself and doing your part in that dynamic. What you don't allow to upset you or disturb you are those events outside of yourself.
mm,
And so that's a way, I think this is what we're landing on. It's a way to be involved, it's a way to be positively influential, and it's a way to still care without having both the, both it's as you said, it's a heavy load to carry, and it's also kind of ineffective if you get burnt out,
mm,
or you get discouraged or get angry. This is a quote from your book that I really liked. You said, "You're more likely to be an effective agent of justice and change if you channel Stoic techniques, including controlling anger." And that's something I agree with. And I always give this example of, I think of the example of a surgeon where it's like, when you have a surgeon operating on you, does you want that person being like, this is the most important thing I've ever done? Like, if this person dies, I won't be able to live with myself. It's like, no, you want somebody who like recognizes it's important, but is cool and calm because they're totally focused on the execution of their technique. That's kind of,
mm,
that's a way that I think about it. And it's like, okay, there's nothing wrong with the surgeon doing that. I don't want the surgeon to be upset about the fact that I might die. I want them to be, focused on themselves, and they're still helping.
Mm. Yeah, and you don't want a surgeon who, you know, wants applause after the operation. Like you want them to, which is kind of, what we were talking before about, like, well, writers, going on Goodreads or podcasters going on YouTube and seeing what the comments say. You want to just focus on the thing itself that you're doing, and you want to do it to the best of your ability. And you also want
Mhm.
that in a surgeon. Like you don't want them kind of when you wake up going, "How was I? Was I amazing? Yeah, in your stomach, was I great?" That's and they don't operate that way for a reason. So yeah, yeah. But the counterpoint thing, I think, is another reason why I want to bring Stoicism much more, mass audience, because it is a counterpoint to so much of what our culture worships at the moment. Like if the algorithms worship or reward strong responses, angry responses, like angry tweets get, there is a bias in the machine towards high emotion, and it's not being really counted at the moment. Um, we've got to bring the temperature down, I think, and Stoicism is a great way of doing that. And so the more that people can see it, and the more that people can read about it and learn about it, they can say, well, there is an alternative to the very hot kind of atmosphere that we're living in right now, and it's an atmosphere that is getting hotter because of the way that machines and social media reward certain types of emotions.
And is that what your next book is about? Are you able to talk about that at all?
Yeah, sure. I finished it this weekend, which is exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's actually a fable, so it's a novel, a Stoic novel, which has been something I've been wanting to do for ages because I think it can be hard to talk about Stoicism in the abstract. It's something that really rewards story and having examples. So yeah, it's about a person that goes on a journey to interview a sage, and they get given 3 days with this sage, and it's a conversation. Um, and the conversation covers everything. It covers all the whole of life stuff that's Stoicism's so good at. But also things happen to this person on this journey, which means they need the Stoicism. So it's and it's accessible. So it's not necessarily a book where it's a simple story, and and people like being told a story. So I'm hoping with this one, which comes out next year, 2025, that the story element will also bring more people in. It's not just another book which is, this is my journey into Stoicism. It's more like this is everyone's journey, and this is a journey of this
Mhm.
character. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
It's great. I remember talking to Massimo Pigliucci,
Mm.
and he made the point, why people don't read Aristotle is because the Stoics had stories, they had anecdotes and examples, and you read Epictetus, and it's like these interesting kind of a day in the life. You read
Well, like the
Aristotle, and it's like
land,
lecture notes. Yeah, exactly, right. It's like,
the
and so that's why people don't read Aristotle. And I mean, that connects, like what you're talking about is that, I mean, that's what Plato did, right? That's what,
land.
um, that's what lots of that's a big part of the ancient Greek tradition, is making this myth or this story, characters going on a dialogue and talking to each other about these ideas. Um, is there a favorite, along those lines? Is there a book, a movie, a story from the Stoics? Is there a story that for you captures the spirit of Stoicism that you find inspirational, you turn to?
I'm always interested in the Stoics in exile. Like I think that to me is really interesting. Because they were sometimes we feel exiled and excluded in our lives today. Like we have a social exile or whatever. But these guys were actually like properly exiled. They were sent away to like islands, and so how did they deal with that? What were they doing there, and how did they cope with it? Because I like since sort of reading about the Stoics in exile, particularly Seneca, and I think Musonius Rufus as well was exiled a number of times. You then see exile everywhere in today's world, like Navalny, exiled to Siberia. Anyone who's a refugee, exiled from their homeland. So I think that's always instructive to me is how to deal how did they deal with exile? Where can I see exile today? And I think there's a modern Stoic. God, I've just forgotten his name. He's a great writer though. I've read John Irving, Bill Irvin.
Oh, yes, Bill
Bill,
Irving.
yeah. So he writes about being sent to an aged care home as a form of exile, and how we can learn to cope with that from the Stoics. So anything on exile is great. I love Seneca's like life story because you can go into all the madness of Nero and all the poisonings and the kind of the ship that Nero built for his mother that kind of collapsed, but she survived. And James Rom's book on Seneca,
Hmm.
Dying Every Day, I love. It's a great book, and Emily Wilson's is good as well. But yeah, gee, there's some amazing stories. Like they lived in incredible times. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's why. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here. I think we're both on the Stoic team, but sometimes I get defensive when people they'll hear a story about Epictetus saying, kiss your child on the forehead, and when you do, tell yourself, you too will die, like my child will die. And people go, oh, what a terrible philosophy. It's so dark. And it's like, this was a time when it was very, very common for your children to die before you, right?
Mm,
Like it's a very weird thing to kind of, I mean, it's the thing you were talking about. In one hand, they've lived through what we've lived through and they have this perspective and nothing's new. And on the other hand, it's a different world. It's like both these things at the same
mm,
time.
mm,
Um, and, uh, so that example of exile, it's like that is such a terrible, terrible thing that me growing up in Canada, that's not really a thing that I considered happening, but it's a thing that happened to many of them and they wrote about and they considered very deeply. And it is still a thing happening in other parts of the world today, as you gave. I never thought about that before, but an excellent kind of modern examples of being a refugee, for example, and being kind of forcibly removed from your community. And so we need people writing about these things from positions of experience. And I find it empowering, this view of, okay, well, if this person can live through that, kind of recontextualizes my problems, kind of recontextualizes, traffic and some interpersonal disagreements. Um,
mm.
so I find it motivational just to see what people are able to do and survive, not just survive, but survive well.
I'm curious about why you think this time. I mean, I think that these times, for whatever reason, feel very closely aligned, even though it's completely different. Feel very closely aligned with those Stoic kind of almost pre-Christian times, and that like reading Chaucer and reading Seneca. It's like, how did Chaucer come after Seneca? Like everything's different. Christianity, like that, the Dark Ages, like it feels like that's a different world. But the world of the Stoics, and their language and their kind of their interest in feasting, boozing, like they partied, and they had all these teachings on how to deal with kind of hangovers and too much alcohol, and it feels very modern, and I think that might explain why there's an interest in Stoicism today. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. It's one of those things that I always find hard to answer because you just kind of know it when you see. Like I fell in love with it. I didn't respect it. It was like it just hit me. So the question is, why is it hitting me? I think part of it for me, the way is that I didn't grow up in a religious household. I never. So you talked about that North Star, and I think that's a really good way of putting it. I never really had a North Star, and I was also resistant to North Stars that were based on faith. I was very
Mm,
resistant to any sort of North Star where it said, okay, well, you should live like this. Why? Well, that's just what it says. Or
mm,
you just need to believe it. Or any sort of resistance to argument. And I found Stoicism and all ancient Greek philosophy. I just think the Stoics are right. I just think they have better
Mm,
arguments than the others. But I think that was a way where it's like, here's a North Star, and we'll debate it with you. That's fine. Like, we welcome that. I remember there's this line in Marcus Aurelius where he says, if somebody can show me that Stoicism's false, I'd gladly give it up. I'm after the truth, and the truth never hurt anybody.
mm,
And that goes back to your tattoo about reality, right?
mm,
Um, I think that was it. It was a North Star that welcomed questioning, and then I guess that's what. But that's ancient Greek philosophy. So why
mm,
Stoicism in particular? For me personally, it always resonated with self improvement. I was always really interested in self development. I came from an athletic background. In terms of why it's appealing to other people, I'm not sure. Part of it, I think, also is historical in that it actually wasn't accessible to other people. So why didn't it appeal to people in the 40s? Well, people in the 40s just didn't have access to it in the way we do now, which is like um, well written translations, people like yourself writing accessible books about the topic that people who say, well, I didn't study philosophy, or philosophy is boring. Maybe they pick up your book, they read Reasons Not to Worry, and they go, this is actually really applicable. And so um, I think there's more stoicism now than there ever was before. But at the end of the day, that's a bit of a chicken and the egg. Maybe there is because it's
mm.
appealing more to people. So I don't know if that's the best answer.
Yeah. I just feel like it hits real, like it's you read it and you're like, wow, that's
Yeah,
and you
100%.
can apply it to the internet. Like that's the crazy thing for me. You can apply a lot of how they dealt with insults back in the day. You can apply to beefs on social media. So it's yeah. I
Yeah,
read some of it and I go, how is this written 2,000 years ago? It's so good.
when you have a chapter. I think it's how to deal with social media, or how to be on social media. Yeah, how to be on social media, which is great. You can almost think of that. You can almost feel. I mean, I'm looking at the things here. You'll feel sorry for the insulter. Use humor,
Yeah.
um, and you can almost feel like X.com as because the Stoics talk about you receive an impression and you've got to kind of evaluate it. And it's like that is the internet is just nonstop impressions, right? Like that's the best example of just like
They
you
even
will be
call how you
confronted.
look at pages as an impression, How
Yeah,
many page
exactly. Oh,
impressions
that's a
did
great way of putting it. Yeah.
yeah.
So it's like there's 100,000 people that have received an impression, and as you said, there probably a lot of them got angry. One last question I wanted to ask is we've hit on this a bit about you talked about the tension between social justice and or just just causes in general, kind of being an active contributor, and the dichotomy of control. We've talked about the highs and the lows, and how you've got to give up some of the highs to keep the lows. Is there anything about stoicism that you actually disagree with, or anywhere where it's failed you that you'd say, well, I don't know if I'm a stoic about this?
Yeah, at the moment, and in this book, I'm exploring it a lot more. Is desire. So I think desire is, I can find barely any sort of mention of like sexuality or infatuation or you know, like even just having a crush on someone. So it's such a part of life, and it's you know, they kind of say, oh well, you can't control if someone else likes you, so therefore don't have that desire, and I find that an unsatisfying, you know, it's an unsatisfying principle. They talk about Chrysippus talking about the cart, with the dog attached, and you've got to stop it before it races down the hill. And they didn't understand, I guess, hormones, neuroscience, biology, the fact that desire is it's not necessarily a switch that you can turn off and on. Desire will often give us information, and that includes not just sexual desire, but it includes desire um, for justice or desire for an outcome, or anger is in some ways desire for justice. If you feel like you've been wronged, you get angry. And Martha Nussbaum, who is, I think, a Princeton philosopher, wrote a great book called The Therapy of Desire, about this, the Stoic problem with desire. And it's a fantastic book. And there's a really good podcast called Philosophize This, which I don't know if you've listened to that.
Yeah, no, big fan. I think it's great.
Yeah, it's a really good podcast. So he has just done an episode on Nussbaum and desire, and how it is it is something that contains information. It's not just something that we should throw out. And the Stoics were kind of saying, oh, well, if it's not in your control, just get over that desire. And it's not that easy.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think Martha Nussbaum's an amazing philosopher. I really, really love her stuff. She's a book called Upheavals of Thought, which is basically it's pretty much like a contemporary argument for Stoic theory of emotions. I think her work is just is fantastic, and she's one of those few thinkers that is a world class ancient Greek philosopher, and also writes about contemporary philosophy of motion, contemporary politics. Really, really impressive. The desire stuff I think is interesting. Maybe part of it could be this argument of we want to live in accordance with nature, but part of our nature is to experience desire, and that part of our nature has been not accepted or embraced enough by the Stoics, or the way that they talked about it was outdated. I think the stuff about sexuality or romantic relationships is a because part of what we love about the Stoics we talked about is like, wow, they talk about things like going out to the bath and people are being annoying. Like, how do you deal with that? Going to work and waking up and not want to get out of bed. So it is actually interesting, the amount of the lack of discussion of like romantic relationships, which is such a fundamental part of it. I think that's a really, really good point. One of the Stoic answers to this, which not sure if you've come across it, is this idea that we should be romantically attracted to other people's characters. So we should like
That
love the
sounds so
virtue in them.
hot.
Yeah.
um,
But
oh yeah, I guess. Right, but that sounds over intellectualizing it. Um, I mean, it could be a societal thing of how they existed back then. So they were very pro marriage because marriage was stability, and it was a great way to raise children. Um, and you read like, say, the letters to Lucilius or Marcus, and is it Frodo, his former tutor, and they are romantic. There is romance in the friendships. Like there is love in the letters. The way that they talk, greet each other, my dear, blah blah. I've been thinking about you. You've been on my mind. It's a way that friends don't talk to each other these days. But there was a lot of romance, I think, back then in friendship. Um, but desire, like that's the kind of missing part of the puzzle for me. And I think that's why Martha's work is great, because she's trying to fill in something that is a bit of a blank. And Seneca said, like there'll be other, I can't remember the exact quote, but he basically left the door open for people to come in and improve on Stoicism. He's like, there'll be others, there'll be science, there'll be other things that come after us, and the philosophy should change according to new discoveries. And I love that flexibility about Stoicism. It's not like Christianity, where I'm not, or many other religions, where me as a follower of that is not able to just add on bits. Like it's either in the Bible or it's not. And you have to have achieved hierarchy in the church in order to kind of suggest doctrinal changes. Whereas Stoicism is so egalitarian, it's so open to putting your own spin on it, to saying, well, what do we know now about the neuroscience or biology of desire? What do we know about
mhm.
the unconscious? We know all this stuff, so let's improve on what the Stoics said.
Comes back to that idea again of reality of we when we add to Stoicism, we can get it wrong, but the Stoics want the theory to correspond with the way things are. And so if we've learned something different about the way things are, we should add to it or modify. I always think there can be there is like a balance you want to strike, which I think is that, or at least in my own practice, which is to kind of understand what ancient Stoicism was, and don't read modern interpretations into it, like kind of keep it as it is. And then you've got on the other side, you've got your current practice or your current way of reflecting with it, and that is open to modification. But just because it's as long as you don't throw it backwards, I think it's all fair game. And which is to say, you don't want to misread Seneca and add something into Seneca, because then you're losing the value of it if you're changing it. But once it's like, okay, now if this tradition had continued on, obviously it would be very different. Obviously there would be modifications. And so now, as long as we're taking up that spirit, what modifications, what changes can we make, both to serve ourselves better, but also to accurately represent the way things are, right?
Definitely.
Totally agree. So just as we're wrapping things up, Brigid, thanks so much for talking with me. I really love your mission of spreading Stoicism to more people. I think your relationship with Stoicism is a wonderful one, of just somebody who wants to put this into practice and wants to help other people do it too. For those that listen to this episode and want to engage with more of your work or know more about what's going on, you've got your book, Reasons Not to Worry. It's a great book. I recommend it to anybody listening. But anything else that you would say to those people? Anywhere else they can engage with your work?
So I'm currently a political speechwriter. So the work is not. I'm writing I'm writing for politicians. So there's nothing current, but I've got 8 years of work on the Guardian website. I had a column called Brigid Delaney's Diary. So and it was like a lot of them were humorous columns. So if you're interested, that's on the Guardian website. I've got 4 books: Reasons Not to Worry, Wellmania, which is also on Netflix, and a novel called Wild Things, and another book called This Restless Life. And next year, my Stoic novel is coming out, so we'll have to have a chat about that, and I'll make sure you get an advance copy. And I'm on Twitter at BrigidWD, BRIGIDWD. If you do an angry tweet at me, I'll be very stoic and not respond.
Yeah, that's a guarantee. I was saying, if we can brave Twitter, put your stoicism to the test on there. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.